I'm going to be talking to Professor Shaun Fluker, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Calgary, about a recent ABLAWG post of his, COVID-19 and the Emergencies Act of Canada, Redux. So welcome to the interview, Shaun.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, this is a lawyer's argument in the ABLAWG post, and I'll get you to explain it, but the line from your post that really caught my attention is that the real emergency here is a governance and legitimacy crisis for government. And you don't mean the Canadian government, you actually mean the UCP government in Alberta of Jason Kenney. Am I correct?
Yeah, the argument is directed particularly at the provinces. That would include Alberta. The argument is essentially that, you know, we've seen nearly 2 years now of decision making in a very authoritarian style that doesn't accord with, you know, our basic understandings of democratic dialogue. You know, sometimes little or no explanation given for some of these rulings, which have significant impact on people. And, you know, we saw a little bit of, you know, isolated resistance and defiance to some of this stuff last spring and summer. We're just seeing a lot more of it now.
So if I understand your argument correctly, Shaun, it's that the style of a government that the UCP has practiced since they came to power in April of 2019 has led eventually to this crisis, which then boiled over in Ottawa, but essentially led by Albertans, because really of the pandemic policies and management style, government governance style of Kenney and the UCP. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think you do have that right. I mean, Alberta's not the only province that's had some of these issues, but Alberta is definitely one of the provinces that has most of these issues. You know, we go back to the fall of 2020 when, you know, the real, you know, tough restrictions in the second wave were implemented. And right, we had those incidents where it appeared that members of the UCP caucus didn't feel like they were, that they had to obey those rules that everybody else had to obey. We've had instances of finger pointing between the Premier's office, the Minister of Health, the Chief Medical Officer. All of this eventually leads to a legitimacy crisis. And that's what we're seeing now. I mean, for sure.
Well, look, I've interviewed other experts, and I'll give you one example. Professor Lorian Hardcastle, colleague of yours, who argued in an interview that the Kenney government, she's never seen a government as incompetent as the Kenney government. So, for instance, you know, they would come up with policies late in the day, one day, and a public health order would have to be hastily written overnight by a bureaucrat and then enacted the next day, and then they would be full of inconsistencies and errors and you know, almost unworkable. And the problem wasn't the bureaucrats, the problem was the government taking so long to make a decision and then making a poor decision and leaving the bureaucrats no time to properly implement it. And multiply that over numerous policies and public health measures, and it's no wonder the people are frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, I've been making similar observations to that over the last couple of years. You know, let me maybe illustrate a counterpoint here into how this could have been done better, because that's what you're seeing in Ottawa today, actually. You know, a process that's legislated where these sorts of measures and decisions, albeit made quickly, and sometimes they have to be, are subject to an open dialogue, debate, criticism, possible amendment, and even revocation after the fact in a forum like the elected assembly. I mean, that has been completely absent in Alberta and other provinces too. But you know, it's a really good illustration of how to do this sort of lawmaking in a much more acceptable way than what we have seen, because it's that non-transparency that really opens the door to the kind of lawmaking that we've seen, right? Where, you know, decisions can be made late, at the late hour of any given day, announcements can take people by surprise the next day. This is the sort of thing that, was acceptable to some extent, or to a large extent, perhaps 2 years ago in March of 2020. It lost that legitimacy a long time ago. And I'm a little bit surprised, frankly, it took as long as it did for some of these protests to unfold the way they have. And, then we can get into the response of the governments to this. I suppose that's one of your next questions, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, what about the federal government's response? Was it timely? Was it the proper response, in your opinion?
Well, the argument I make in the ABLAWG post is that the declaration of a national public order emergency is needed to restore some legitimacy in democratic process and the rule of law. And I mean, I think it'll serve some of that purpose, even if these powers are not ever really used, because it demonstrates, I think, to the people generally that the government is attempting to bring, some semblance of order to what's going on. Counter that to the approach taken, for example, here in Alberta with the Coutts blockade, where the government seemed reluctant to use the powers that it has, surprisingly.
Yeah, I think it's a fair observation, Shaun, because it's been made over and over the last 2 years, but particularly since last summer, when the best summer ever, as it's known in Alberta, where basically it's very clear that the UCP and Kenney are sublimating public health to political considerations. And it appeared again that was what was happening at Coutts. These were essentially, Kenney supporters, Kenney probably party members that were there at Coutts, and therefore he wasn't prepared to take action because there was might be a political cost to him, and he was prepared to let these protesters, the blockaders, hold the governments to hostage for that. And is that the kind of illegitimacy you're talking about?
Well, I mean, yeah. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been heavily politicized in Alberta. It's hard to know if the decisions made by the government going forward are made for public health reasons or political reasons. There's always been some question about that, over the course of the pandemic. But now, so it appears to be even more so now when you have, a leader, of the UCP party whose very leadership is being questioned internally as well. So you're left to wonder if some of these decisions are being made more with that in mind than, with public health in mind. And again, that could be one way or the other, I suppose. From a governance perspective, for me, it always comes back to the same point, which is to say, there's no there's no transparency in any of this. So people are left to speculate one way or the other. The legislative session is about to get underway again here in Alberta here shortly. But there's just been too much darkness surrounding these sorts of, pandemic related public health restrictions going all the way back to, to the beginning in March of 2020. But absolutely, it appears to be becoming more and more politicized as we continue to move on.
You note an irony here that I can't let go without in passing, and that is that this crisis in Ottawa, the need to invoke the Emergencies Act, was in part, at least, caused by Jason Kenney and his style of governance and in Alberta. And yet, so here he is, and yet he criticizes it today and yesterday as being too draconian and not required and not needed. So he creates the conditions for it where it's necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act, and then he criticizes the Prime Minister for bringing it in. Sorry, that strikes me as a little ironic.
Yeah, well, I think the technique being used here is that Premier Kenney is, I think, misconstruing the nature of the emergency, which is one of the points I make in the ABLAWG. I mean, yes, there's a need to clear out blockades and occupations, and that has largely taken place in some places and not others. But to go back to the earlier point, I mean, the real emergency here is emergency in the nature of legitimacy in government. And again, the federal government and the provinces made a choice 2 years ago to more or less leave public health restriction measures to the provinces. The federal government, of course, has continued to have a role in relation to international travel, trade, and the like. But for the most part, these have been provincial measures, and they've been made in a way that really offends our basic understanding of democratic process. And I think we've got to the point where some level of government had to do something. I mean, we've even got bickering potentially between the province and the municipalities in this province over things like continuing with masking requirements and things like that. I mean, that no matter where you fall on the outcome of those debates, I mean, I think you have to agree that it's terribly unhealthy for levels of government in the province, municipalities and the provincial government, for example, to actually openly disagree about this kind of stuff. I mean, to me, that's the really disappointing aspect of this, and I think we're going to be living with it for some time.
Well, that leads to my final question, Shaun, which is does the Kenney government, the UCP government, have a legitimacy crisis of its own?
Well, I certainly think it does. I mean, you've got open, internal bickering, questioning of the premier, and that all coming to a head here shortly. And you've have just a 2 years of really a real difficult governance style that comes across as non-transparent, arbitrary, politicized, taking issue with physicians in the middle of a pandemic. There's recently ministerial directions to institutions and schools over things that really there's really no place for those sort of declarations in a democratic government. So yeah, I think the Alberta government is currently facing a very serious legitimacy crisis.
Well, it almost sounds like the adults had to come in and clean up Jason Kenney's mess, and now he's crying about it, but we'll see how this unfolds. Thank you very much, Shaun. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me.